Hi, and welcome to the next video. As you can see, I'm a little bit different than in the prior videos, trying out a new old look, pun intended, if you like. Anyhow, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the Chinese and the Japanese language. And in part, I'm going to be talking about these two because there's a comment that I see in a lot of the forums, YouTube, and different places when it comes to expats and why expats don't seem to learn the language, or why aren't they as fluent as they should be in the language. So I'm going to be addressing this regarding these two languages because these are the ones I was exposed to. These are the languages in two countries that I had lived in, so I feel I'm a little bit of an authority in regards to this, as well as being an expat, so I know what the experience is like. Now, by no means does this mean that this is the end of the conversation, or that there may not be other points to consider or things that I missed. However, these are just my observations, my opinions, and I'm going to be putting links to some of the things I'm going to be talking about, so you can go ahead and do your own research and make up your own mind. But like I said, this is just my response to something that I hear a lot of people say, which again was, why don't you guys learn the language? Well, I've got my list. Let's go through it. I'm going to start first with Chinese, and then talk about Japanese, and then talk about some things that are similar between both languages to give an overall, an in-depth picture into the language. So first, let's start with Chinese. Now, if we were to look at the Chinese language, and by the Chinese language I don't mean Mandarin, not at this point in the conversation, but traditional Chinese. And you think about how it's written using a set of characters. Now, when people say, hey, why don't you just learn the language? Well, there's one thing that they don't realize, and it's something I had to look up, which is, how many characters does traditional Chinese have? Well, if you didn't already know, you would probably be very surprised to know that there are 100 or over 100,000 characters. Now, granted, some of these are proper, names, place names, and things like that. However, that is quite the large number. So when someone says, hey, you should learn the language, you have to consider that that's a lot of characters to memorize. And that's just the traditional Chinese. Now fast forward to about Mao Zedong's time. One of the things that I'll give him credit for, because it was ingenious, was that he realized the language was overly complex. So he decided, let's narrow it down to fewer characters so that we can get people, literate, up to speed and function. So if you don't already know, well, Mandarin, or Putonghua as they say, is about 20 to 23,000 characters. So significantly smaller, but still a very large number of characters to learn. And one of the problems with the simplified version of these characters, which is something the Taiwanese picked up on quickly, is that you're going to have a hard time reading traditional and historic documents. They're going to have to be translated from, the traditional Chinese 100,000 character system down to this 20 to 23,000 character system. Which, like I said, that's a lot of characters to learn. Now, some people will now counter with this, saying, well, to read a newspaper or function, you need only about 3 to 6,000 or 4 to 8,000 characters at most. Fair enough. That is significantly less than 100,000 or 20 to 23,000. But still, that's a lot of characters to learn. And you're not going to pick up those things overnight or within a year. It's going to take years of study to get to that point. Next point. And I've been focusing so far just on the characters. And a lot of people will now counter, or have already countered with, well, speaking is a lot easier. To a degree it is. I'll say that. But you have to consider that Chinese, unlike some non-Asian languages, I'll say it that way, has tones. meaning that for every subset of sounds, there are at least 4 to 5 variants. For example, ma, 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 ma. Now, to most people, that would just be the same sound. But for the Chinese language, those are 4 to 5 different individual sounds. One's a rising tone, one's a falling tone, one drops and rises, one's high, and then one's no tone. Now you're probably wondering to yourself, okay, well, why do they have these differences? Well, because they have different meanings. So that ma, depending on the tone that you used, is going to have a separate meaning for each one of those tones. So one will be horse, one will be hemp, one will be rope, one will be a question particle, and so on. So as someone learns Chinese, you're going to have to realize that these sounds completely change the meaning of whatever it is you're saying or is being said to you, versus other languages where what you say is exactly what it is. The meaning doesn't change, with the exception of what I'll go into next. Homonyms. For those who don't know what homonyms are, they're words that have the same sound, right, or pronounced exactly the same way. You know, in the English language, we have several of these, right? For example, bear and bear. You know, one's the animal and one's to put up with something, you know, or burden oneself with something. However, in the context of the sentence or of a conversation, we can kind of gauge which one it is. Well, now, with Chinese, keep in mind what I talked about with the ma's also applies. So you can have a ma that might mean horse, but then there may be another word in the Chinese language that might mean something else, but is pronounced exactly the same, you know, tone and all as that one word. So now they're adding a further level of complexity. And keep in mind, one basic sound, 5 different, you know, ways to pronounce it with 5 different meanings, and now you have homonyms, so you're multiplying that out, that complexity out even further. So the spoken part can be just as complex as the written part, because now you're adding layer upon layer upon layer of complexity to very simple sounds. Next point, Chengyu. Now, for those that don't know what Chengyu are like well-known Chinese idioms. They're usually 4 characters long, and they usually carry a little more meaning than what's apparent. And for example, and I'll go just with the translated version so I don't, you know, destroy the tones in this, but there's a phrase in Chinese called "kill the chicken to scare the monkey," and it's, you know, it's even further compartmentalized to "kill chicken, scare monkey." Now, the meaning behind this is you want to deter some kind of action, you know, or by doing something to either punish or to deter said action from happening, you know. Now, these were commonly used throughout Chinese history as a way to convey meaning in a very easy and short and concise manner, instead of going through, you know, long complex sentences or going through a whole speech or, you know, paragraph worths of information to convey meaning. They would just use this. And you would think that this would make things easier because, okay, there's this really complex language. We're gonna take these set phrases and put them out there so that the listener can understand what the speaker says without having to go through, you know, complex tones and all this kind of stuff. Which the intent was good. However, it fails from, you know, the concise, not only precision, but the conciseness actually adds to the problems of understanding it. For example, if you were in ancient China and you're the emperor and you use this phrase, you know, let's say one of your subordinates was reporting, hey, we have an uprising coming up, or there's an uprising happening. What do we do? And the emperor says, kill chicken, scare monkey. Well, the person hearing this, or his underling, has to kind of try to understand what exactly does the emperor want me to do. Does he want me to go out and kill the people, partaking of this uprising? To scare everyone else from taking part in it? Does he want me to punish them? To then deter the others from taking action? Or is there something else he wants me to do? Like maybe put in some laws in place that just on their face will scare the populace from continuing with the uprising. Unless the emperor says more, or the subordinate is free to ask for more details, we don't know. And that's one of the problems with Chengyu. It does convey meaning, but there are many layers and subtleties to that meaning that alone it cannot give. Next thing. And this is something Chinese doesn't have as much as it used to in the past, but there would be words that would be used as, honorifics, where instead of saying you or he or someone, you would use words like ru to designate a person of importance, or to be polite when referring to a particular individual or set of individuals. Now, in ancient Chinese, you had more of this. You don't have this as much now. I imagine now just work titles or, any kind of modern titles are used, like, teacher, teacher Chen, Chen Lao Shi, that kind of stuff, which makes sense. But keep in mind that not so long ago in Chinese history, you had these. So now you have to memorize the polite form and the casual form. So adds to the further level of complexity of the language. Last point, talking about Chinese. And it's something that other expats have pointed out to me when I was there, and I saw it firsthand as well, is conversation jumping. One of the things that Chinese has is whenever they refer to he or she or it, they use the same word, which is ta. Now, in written form, it's completely different. You'll see it, talking about a man, talking about a woman, talking about an object, and right away. But in spoken language, unless you're in the conversation already, and somebody says ta, you're not going to know. And this was something that someone told me, conversation jumping. It's very difficult for somebody to jump into a Chinese conversation and understand who the players are simply based on the he, she word, because it's the same exact word. So if there are more than two people that are being referred to in that conversation, people are lost. You have to then go to descriptors or names. And granted, in other languages, if you have people with the same name, that can happen. But because other languages use a separate word for he and she and it, it's a little more clear who and what you're talking about and in what the relation is between them. With Chinese, you have to stop, go back, explain. And this is not to knock on the Chinese language. This is just the way it is, and it adds another layer of complexity. So when people say, hey, learn the language, it's like, well, the written is difficult, the spoken is complex, meanings can change, and now you have this problem when you're jumping into a conversation. Who's he? Who's she? Is it a he? Is it a she? Is it in it? I'm a little confused. What's the relation amongst each other? Moving on to Japanese. Now, for those that study Japanese, you know that some of the Japanese language, or a good portion of it, actually comes from Chinese. So let's start with the characters. So the kanji, which is generally the word for characters, or for the characters that are used in the Japanese language, sometimes referring to all characters, but in this particular case I'm going to focus it on referring to Chinese characters. Japanese borrows about 50,000 Chinese characters. So not as complex as traditional Chinese, but halfway there. And again, many of them could be place names and proper nouns and whatnot. So it's understandable you don't necessarily need to know all of them. Just like you don't need to know all the names of all ancient civilizations and their historical cities and capitals and so on, on regular conversation. But still, that's a lot of characters. And if you know anything more about Japanese, you know that it doesn't just end there in the written form. There are several others. For example, hiragana, which accounts for about another 48 or so characters into the Japanese language. Katakana, about another 48 characters. Furigana, and romaji. And wasn't able to look up how many furigana characters there are. I'll look it up later and put it somewhere in this video. But romaji, for those that don't know what that is basically the alphabet that we used in the English language and many other modern languages, for example Spanish. So they also use that, much like the Chinese use pinyin to help people, non-speakers and even some locals see the basic alphabets that are used and sound out different characters and things. So Japanese has got a little over 50,000 with all these different written forms. So when people say you should learn Japanese, the question is, okay, do you mean hiragana, katakana, and romaji, or do you mean all 50,000 of these characters? And again, there will be a subset of those that you will need to learn to be able to just read a newspaper or some, basic books. You're not going to need to know all of them, but still, it's going to be a significantly large number that you're going to need to learn. So it's not an easy language. And another thing about learning Japanese is that Japanese, like I had mentioned with Chinese, has honorifics. And the difference between the two languages is they use them to this day. So whenever you are speaking to somebody, you have to consider their and your social standing. Is this person at a higher position than me or a lower position? Is this person older or younger? Because the way that you speak to them is going to change. You're going to use different types of words to be more polite and show respect to that person, and or vice versa. And most foreigners, when they learn the Japanese language, they just use the casual form of it, or they just go with the more polite version. And you think that, well, if they're using the casual one all the time in casual situations, they'll be fine. If they're using the polite one in polite situations, they'll be fine. But the problem is, it's adding another layer of complexity to the language. And many times, and there are plenty of people on YouTube who've talked about this, where a foreign person, let's say, uses the polite form all the time, and when they're speaking to somebody casually, and that person, because they're more in tune with the culture and the cultural linguistic aspects of it, they get offended. Even though it wasn't the intention of the foreign person or the expat to, speak to them politely in the wrong circumstance, thus insulting them. It was just they didn't cue in on when do I use this word or this type of phrasing or speak in this manner versus speaking in a different manner. So now they have to learn that cultural linguistic difference, adding another complexity to the language. That's where I'll stop on Japanese, because one reason, well, Japanese doesn't have tones, thank God. So there's not that level of spoken complexity. However, there are some common elements that I'm going to be talking about between Japanese and Chinese that I think are important to this discussion. So let's go. First one, media subtitles. One of the things I wasn't aware of until I lived both in China and Japan was that when you watch TV, whether it's news, whether it's drama, sports, it doesn't matter what kind of programming it is. And it doesn't matter what type of TV you have. The one thing I noticed right away that surprised me was that everything is subtitled by default. Meaning, if you're watching the news, there are going to be subtitles at the very bottom of the TV. Even if you don't press the closed caption, /subtitles button. It's just there by default. Same thing, you watch a period piece, there they are. You go and watch a movie, there it is. It's always there by default. And one of the reasons that I, later on after living in these places for a while, realized why they have that is precisely because the written form is so complex and so hard to learn that they have to put it there in part to help people see it again and just kind of as a refresher. Oh, okay. Oh, these are the characters for these words. Right. In case people forgot, or here's a new word. Oh, what's that character? Oh, there's the character. Now I know. So it's a way for people to constantly see it to help keep their memory of these characters going, right? Or, like I had mentioned with Chinese, that there are homonyms, just like Japanese, I'm sure, has homonyms as well. It's so that if people hear it, and maybe they didn't catch the full context of the conversation or what's going on, they can see it and go, oh, it's a he. Oh, it's a she. Oh, it's this set phrase or whatnot. And to me, that just shows how complex the language is. You don't see this with English. You don't see this with Spanish and other languages that have alphabets, because there's a very finite number of homonyms that can exist. Contexts in which, oh, I'm not sure if it's this this word or this word, and or most people know the words in general, so they don't need to see the words again and again and again, unless you're hard of hearing, there's some kind of accent or something going on in the programming, and so on. You'll know the words. You'll understand just by watching the program what's going on. You may miss one or two things, which happens to everyone, but the majority of it you'll catch. Not so in China, not so in Japan. That's why the subtitles are there. Next, length of study of these languages by locals. I talked about in a previous video how that in the guest house I stayed at in Osaka, there was a college student who was going through a newspaper, had a dictionary right next to her, and was writing down, circling things in the newspaper and checking it in the dictionary and writing it down. And we had asked her, oh, what's going on? Why are you doing this? And she explained it, that even though she was a college student, even though she was Japanese born and raised and, knew characters and could read and write, there were a lot of characters she didn't know and she had to write them down. Versus in other parts of the world, the newspaper is written in such a way that someone with an elementary school education or a high school education at most can read it and understand it. But they're not going to have dozens of words they're not going to understand or know or have never seen. That's very rare, almost impossible. Not so in Japan. It takes decades of studying for somebody to be fluent, or at least fluent enough that the newspaper is not necessarily going to be an issue. Most books aren't going to be an issue for them to read. The same thing is true in China. There are a lot of people who, can't read or write well, or can't even speak well. I've had multiple instances where I've been in a taxi in China, along with friends who had been learning Chinese for, I think at the time, for over a decade. Could read it and write it, to send text messages, write letters and all that. Get in the taxi, they would turn to me and say, hey, you want to tell them where to go? Yeah, sure. I want to go to this place. And I would say it in Chinese. Wouldn't understand. Say it again, say it again, say it again. By about the third or fourth time, my friend would just, blurt it out. And I would hear how he said it, and I go, what's the difference between what you said and I said? It's like, nothing, your Chinese was fine. And I would turn to him and go, well, what's going on then? It's like, he's just illiterate. He doesn't speak Chinese well. And it would just be an older gentleman behind the wheel, and I'm just in shock. What do you mean? He's Chinese. How could he not understand his own language? Complexity. Couple that with dialects, something I didn't talk about, but both countries are going to have people with different dialects who are going to sound out words differently. No different than any other country in the world. I'm not knocking either of them for that. We've got Southerners here, we've got people from Boston, Hispanics, and others. But we understand each other. Over there, the language is so complex, it makes it even harder to understand one another. So it takes a long time of study to master these languages. And by master, I mean learn enough to just get by. Another problem, or commonality between these, tech illiteracy. Now, I know this firsthand from people in China. And I suspect the same thing is probably true in Japan, where nowadays everyone has a smartphone, tablets, laptops that can translate languages smoothly back and forth and, give character support and so on. And one of the things that I've seen firsthand in China, and have read about it as well, is that technology is making people illiterate. And what I mean by that is, in Chinese, like I said, you had these 23,000 to 100,000 character sets for their language. So, when people are young, they just drill writing these things out 100 times, again, over and over for weeks on end and months on end, to be able to internalize these characters, know what they are, know how to write them, and recognize them. Well, nowadays, since people use their electronic devices so much, and that the way that they get the characters is they'll either write in the pinyin, and it'll suggest a list of characters that they'll then go, oh, it's this set. And sometimes it'll even give you a set of phrases, so once you start writing just a few, it's like, oh yeah, that's what I wanted to ask, or that's what I wanted to say. The problem with that is that you lose the ability to write those characters. It's not that the recognition and the writing are in the same centers of the brain. They're not. They're actually in different centers. For example, I have a buddy, his wife is Chinese, and he told me the story where he was trying to figure out how to write something in Chinese, and which he had been doing at that point for over a decade. But he just forgot one character. And he asked his wife, hey, how do you write this character? And she thinks for a moment, she goes, oh, let me get your phone. He's like, no, just tell me how to write it, and I'll go ahead and write it. She's like, oh, I don't remember how to write it. That's why I need your phone. It's creating it's creating it's contributing to illiteracy in the country, because before everything was written. Let's go back to what I said about the media programming, that they're showing subtitles with the characters. So between that and between writing everything out way back in the day before smartphones, the characters were there, you would see them, you would write them, you'd recognize them. Now the technology has gone to the point you don't have to write it. So now you've lost one of the ways in which you would internalize these characters. Which is not to say this doesn't happen in other languages, but in a language so complex as Chinese and Japanese, you're losing a method that's helping you retain the language. Next thing, motivation. And this is something that I have to credit one of my friends for bringing up. So thank you, you know who you are. When learning a language, and this goes back to what I had said about people saying, why don't foreigners learn the language? Well, I've talked about characters, I've talked about tones, I've talked about, all the other things that make it a challenge for anyone to learn these languages. Motivation is the other big one. Now, and of course, it's a big contributor to learning anything, right? If you don't like playing the guitar, if I give you a guitar and give you lessons, you're not going to play it well, or to the best of your ability, Similarly with language, but it goes a step further with language. If you're learning Chinese, the question that is very important is, why are you learning Chinese? Now, if you're a Chinese person, it makes sense. You're in the country, it's your home country, you have to learn it. That's the only way you can get by in your home country and get ahead. Same thing with Japanese. However, since this whole discussion is about foreigners, what's their motivation for learning it? If you're traveling to these countries and you want to be able to speak to locals, then you probably don't need to learn a lot of characters, and you probably need to know very basic conversational phrases, questions, and those sort of things. So the need to learn more, or the complaint from some that, hey, why don't you learn the language, why don't you know more, is kind of moot, because if you're traveling there, there's only so much you need. Switching gears, if you're living there, okay, how long do you plan to live there? Is it going to be a year, 2 years, 5 years? The length of time you stay is going to determine how much you're going to need to absorb. And especially if, depending on the job you have, if you're going to be an English teacher, a lot of people are in China and Japan, or were anyway, before all this craziness. There's only so much of the language you're going to need. You're not going to need to know specialized language for business, unless you're doing direct translations, in which case now you're no longer a teacher, you're a translator, and you need to know, how to translate things back and forth conceptually, literally, and so on. But outside of China and Japan, other than, let's say, for personal interest, there's no real motivation to learn these languages. And it's not me hating on that, I'm a firm believer in learning other languages. I think it's an interesting thing. I enjoy it. I even continue to practice from time to time with little Japanese I learned and the Chinese that I know, just to keep it going. And I've even learned more characters being outside of China than I did while living in China. With that being said, if your intention, like I mentioned before, was to be a translator for Chinese or Japanese, keep in mind, unless you are very, very good and have good connections, it's going to be very difficult for you to get into the industry. And again, I give credit to a friend of mine for bringing this point up. If you're a Chinese company and you're trying to reach an English-speaking market, you're not necessarily going to hire an native English speaker who lived in a foreign country, an American, an Australian, a Brit, and so on. Chances are you're going to hire a Chinese person who have certifications, they might have had experience living abroad, they might have studied abroad, and have that person do the translations because they understand the Chinese culture and language, the subtleties in it innately, and they have a reasonable amount of the language in them to do the translations, versus the person who's living in a foreign country who's learning the language, as their second or third or whatever language. They're going to have more difficulties trying to pick up on the socio-cultural, linguistic aspects of the language. So that's another part of the motivation. Unless you're 100% engaged in becoming a translator in one of these languages, and the stars align for you, it's going to be really difficult for you to pick up those jobs, because they'll just find somebody who's a local who can do the job to a satisfactory level. And this is not to knock on them, because we would probably do the same thing here, where you have somebody here who speaks, reads, and writes Chinese, and they're a native English speaker, and they're one of our own, so to speak, or a local. Versus, all right, let's bring somebody from abroad who internalized a lot of the stuff from the country we're targeting, to where we need the translations done. And it's okay that they don't know our language. We'll deal with those difficulties. We just need them to translate, which is another thing you have to kind of keep in mind. They're going to have to communicate what they want to this translator, and it's easier for them to do it in a shared language, specifically the language they're studying stuff from, than to try to explain that in the language that they are fluent in, but maybe not as native level in as a local. So that's the whole point behind, or one of many points behind, motivation. Final thought on characters, since I talked so much about them, and talked about Chinese having over 100,000, Japanese having over 50,000. Consider a language that most people, or I'd say the vast majority of people, feel is a very, very complex language, and it's a dead language. Egyptian, and I mean Egyptian hieroglyph, or hieroglyphic. A language that a lot of people looked at with its pictograms and think, wow, this is very complex, and in many cases very beautiful looking set of symbols, but how did these people learn to write and read and speak and so on? Egyptian hieroglyphic has only 1,100 characters, meaning that this ancient and commonly thought of highly complex language is simpler than the number of characters you need to learn in Chinese or Japanese to read a newspaper or book. Proof that it's so complex. Anyway, that's the last thing I'm going to say about the languages. Again, I'm not knocking either language. I think they're both beautiful in their own right. And I'm not discouraging anyone from learning either language. For whatever reason. If you want to do it as a hobby, if you want to do it for work, great. Solely up to you. I'm a big proponent of learning other languages. However, the next time someone says to you, "Oh, why, as you know, to you as an expat in China or Japan, why don't you learn the language? Why don't you know the language?" You can point to all these things and show them that their language is not as easy as they make it out to be. That it is both complex in the written and complex in the spoken. Anyway, hope you're doing well. See you in the next video.